to drive programs. So tell us about the Moneyball approach to global development. What does that mean?
Sure. First of all, it was co-written. I wrote it with Raj Shah as sort of a show of bipartisan unity on an important set of issues. This is a refuge, a safe harbor from a lot of the bitterness of American politics. It's one reason I like to stay involved in these issues. Maybe it's the reason that others are involved, but it really is a place where Republicans and Democrats, Raj and I disagree, and I'm sure on a lot of political issues, but we're willing to come together on this. The concept, Moneyball for Government, has generally been a domestic initiative of people from the Republican and Democratic parties that want to use data to guide policy and making sure that a significant portion of funding for programs is actually devoted to the collection and interpretation of data, and then having that tied to outcomes. And that builds a constituency for programs. It shows that they're effective. It shows you really care, by the way. I mean, compassion should be rigorous if we are serious about it. So our chapter was the only one applying this concept in the context of international relations. And Raj has just come from serving in the administration as head of USAID, where he put a huge amount of emphasis on data. And I was involved in the Bush administration in programs like PEPFAR and the President's Malaria Initiatives that were very outcome-oriented, that wanted to be very rigorous in the way that they were done. I think that this is very important in an age of restricted resources. You have to show your outcomes, but it also saves lives. I mean, right now, Deb Burks, the head of PEPFAR, is one of the leaders in this field, where she is going region by region, looking at the highest risk places and groups to do flood zone prevention interventions in order to bend the curve of new infections downward 40 to 60% towards a more sustainable level in the long term. You don't usually think of government with that kind of drive for outcomes. But there are, particularly in global health, but in other areas of development, some of these programs are leaders in these areas. And I think members of Congress should know that. I think the American public would be reassured.
And it's different than it used to be, right? I mean, it wasn't always a data-driven approach. And you said when Raj was at USAID, he really focused on it. So that's something new. It's more innovative than it was maybe 30, 25
Well, this
years
is
ago.
simplistic, but I think true on the whole, that a lot of our, say in Africa, a lot of our a significant portion of our aid during the Cold War was oriented towards geopolitical goals and not real outcomes. And that actually made sense in that context. I'm not being critical of it, but you had friendly leaders and you had unfriendly leaders and you're trying to do a bunch of things. I think that a lot of that began to change, some in the Clinton era, some in the Bush era, where we really had a shift towards outcomes as the measure of our success, not political goals, which Raj and I actually talk about in the chapter as something that sometimes distorts development in ways that are not positive.
So Steve, we talked about measuring development and measuring impact. We have to actually make an impact. In your book, The Great Surge, you highlight all the progress that's really been made. But frankly, when we turn on the nightly news, and polls show this too, Americans are drawn to the challenges, not necessarily the progress. It's really hard to kind of see the progress through the challenges. So can you give us kind of an overview of that progress that you've seen through your travels, through your work? And is there a particular anecdote or story that really you think would resonate with members of Congress tomorrow?
Yeah. So first of all, thanks for having me here. It's great. It's great to be here. Great to be here with Michael. We read in the newspapers every day stories of conflict, of famine, of drought, of things that go wrong, and those are the stories that get attention. What does not get attention are the stories of success, and I think that's true more than any time ever before about development. We live right now in a period over the last 20 years of the greatest period of development progress in human history. Never before have more people in more poor countries made more progress in any time in human history than the last 20 years. The numbers are overwhelming, and they are in almost every aspect of development, and yet nobody knows about this, including members of Congress. And their support, your support, the support of the American people are a part of that story. So what do I mean by this great progress? The number of people living in extreme poverty, under what is now defined as $1.90 a day. There were 2 billion people in 1993 living under $1.90 a day. Now we're down to about 700 million. 1.3 billion people have been lifted out of extreme poverty in 2 decades. There's never been anything remotely like this in human history. Or we can look at incomes. Incomes in developing countries around the world have doubled on average, and in many places more than doubled in 20 years, and that's in real terms after inflation. Or we can look at health. You go back a little further, in 1960, 22% of children in developing countries died before their 5th birthday. 22% died before their 5th birthday, which is hard to imagine. Today we're down to less than 5%, which is still hard to imagine. But from 22% to 5% means that 17% of children, millions and millions of children, 17% of children born in developing countries now live that would have died. And they live because of vaccine programs. They live because of clean water programs. They live because of maternal and child health programs. They live because we've successfully fought malaria in the last 15 years with the President's Malaria Initiative. Malaria deaths have been cut by more than half in 15 years. Think about that. It's the biggest killer in Africa, and deaths have fallen by half in 15 years. And the United States government has been out in the lead with that, with the President's Malaria Initiative. HIV deaths. We know of the terrible tragedies of HIV/AIDS, and they are horrible, and they continue. But HIV/AIDS deaths are down by 1/3 since 2005. How many people knew that? HIV/AIDS deaths have been down by 1/3. A few people knew that, and this is one of the most well-informed audiences in the United States. We hear all about the tragedies of HIV, and we should. But deaths are down by 1/3, and we haven't heard that much about that. And there's no question who's been in the lead in fighting that fight. It's been the United States government, starting early with the Clinton administration, but really built with PEPFAR under the Bush administration. And that's why we have the bipartisan support that Michael was talking about, because we've had this success. But it's still not well enough known. Now, it's not just us. This wouldn't happen. Matter of fact, the lead on this are the heroes and the courageous people in developing countries, the political leaders, the health workers, the nurses, the moms that bring their kids to the clinics to get vaccinated. Those are the real heroes, but we're supporting them. And support from the United States government, there is no question, has saved millions and millions of lives. There's actually no question about it. And when people say foreign aid doesn't work, it's all money down a rat hole, wrong. Wrong. It's saving millions of lives. It's also putting people in school. We're up to 90% of girls now complete primary school in developing countries. 90%. A generation ago, it was less than half. And if 90% of girls are completing school, that means they're going to get married later, they're going to have fewer kids, they're going to have income opportunities, their kids are going to be healthier, and their kids are going to be better educated and have more economic opportunity. We are already planting the seeds for the next generation of success. So this is happening around the world, not in every developing countries. There's still a lot of disasters. That's what we read about. We read about when there's a coup or a war. We don't read about the coups that don't happen in Ghana anymore. We don't read about the war that doesn't happen in Mozambique anymore. We don't hear about all of the violence in Southeast Asia, because there isn't any, or very much anymore. We don't hear about the successes. And that leads to a misunderstanding that we haven't made much progress, when in fact we've made more progress than ever before, and Congress and the American people deserve to take some of the credit for that.
That's really interesting. Some of those stats you rattled off, I didn't know either, and I do this for a living, so there you go.
You haven't read my book yet.
Learn something new. Shoot. Caught.
I'm not here to sell books, but if you go to Amazon.com.
It's okay, you can put a plug in. Steve, you mentioned kind of all the actors that are involved, other countries, NGOs, multilaterals. Another actor that's involved and getting more and more involved every year is businesses. And Michael, I want to ask you about that. You wrote about it in your Moneyball chapter. What is the role of business in development? How are they partnering, and is it working?
Well, ultimately, business is development. We talk about aid flows, and they're very, very important, particularly in disease and to leverage important change. But if you look at the way countries build wealth, national wealth, it comes from foreign direct investment, it comes from local investment and savings and investment. Comes in some cases from remittances, large amounts of remittances. So that's the goal, is ultimately to have an economic environment that attracts investment. Basics of the rule of law. It's one reason that I'm a big fan of Millennium Challenge Corporation, MCC.
We had Dana up here earlier,
right?
CEO.
Which is a conscious effort to say the most important thing that aid can do is to leverage the kind of changes that eventually attract real investment. And MCC works as full partners with local governments to pursue basic things like rule of law and women's rights and empowerment, and the basic rules that relate to corporations. These are very basic things, structures of future wealth that I think we're helping to construct in full partnership with those countries. So that's the ultimate goal. In the meantime, however, businesses can also play a very important role focused on the health of their own employees, that Coca-Cola does and a lot of others, on malaria, on vaccination and other areas. And with philanthropy in partnership with non-governmental organizations in government in really addressing problems or encouraging economic opportunity. I've seen Land O'Lakes programs in Malawi where they encourage people to own their own cow. And the life difference from going from periodic hunger, every year to paying for your children's education is just extraordinary with a single cow. That type of progress can make, even marginal increases in agricultural productivity, for example, or access to energy. These have a dramatic, immediate impact on people's lives. And so that type of business effort is the eventual goal.
Steve, you addressed already we talk about the instability, we talk about the wars, the conflict. You hear about Syria all the time. When was the last time, Lester Holt covered Mozambique on the nightly news, right? Doesn't happen very often. But the increased peace and stability is just as important as us addressing all those conflicts. Addressing the challenges is just as important as addressing and taking advantage of opportunities. So can you tell us about the flip side, what we don't hear on the news, the other side of the world that is more peaceful, and what that means to us?
Sure. So I said already that we live in an era of the greatest development progress in human history. We also live in probably the most peaceful time in human history, which nobody believes because of what we read in the newspapers every day. And I don't want to minimize for a moment what's going on in Syria or the Middle East or South Sudan or the other places where there are conflicts. But the truth is that, unfortunately, human nature being what it is, we have lived in a violent society for a very long time. And if you think back of any time in human history, there's actually been far more war, far more deaths in war than we are suffering through now. And within developing countries today, there are only half as many civil wars going on at any given time as there were in the 1980s. We forget how violent it used to be. Deaths in civil wars are actually down by 3/4. The number of civil wars are down by half, deaths are down by 3/4. But we forget how bad it was. In the 1980s, all of Central America was at war. All of it. And Colombia was a mess, and Shining Path was running around in Peru, and every country in Latin America was run by an authoritarian leader, with the exception of Costa Rica. They're all democracies now, some of them not particularly functional, all of them except Venezuela and Cuba. But there's been a wholesale shift towards democracy and better government, along with more more peace, less violence. In Asia, we have the major conflict going on in Afghanistan. We have the problem in Ukraine. The rest of Asia is at peace. When was the last time in human history when the great Asian landmass with billions of people was at peace? It hasn't happened. 20, 30 years ago, we had, of course, the Vietnam War. We had Suharto invading East Timor. We had the killing fields of Cambodia. We had Sri Lanka and its never-ending civil war. It's over. It's over. And again, there's been a sweep, not completely, but a shift towards democracy. In Indonesia, where I lived for 4 years, the largest Muslim country in the world, anybody who tells you that Islam is not compatible with democracy hasn't visited Indonesia anytime recently. Or in sub-Saharan Africa. In the 1980s and 90s, everywhere in West Africa was at war. Liberia, Sierra Leone, Guinea. Charles Taylor was running around chopping people's hands off. Mozambique was at war. All of southern Africa at the end of apartheid. South Africa itself was in a form of civil war. Mozambique, actual civil war. What is now Namibia was Southwest Africa, was war. It's over. It's done. And again, that's not to minimize the amount of conflict, but there is far less of it. And it is because of the development progress, in part, and it is because of the shift towards democracy and better governance. And all of that, we have been in part leading here in the United States, and all of that is good for our security. This is very good for us, that there are far less conflicts in the world, where we don't have to send so many troops. It is good for us that we have more stable and capable states that can fight diseases and can fight criminal networks and can fight drug trafficking. That's good for us. We need to continue to build that capacity. It's good for us that we are helping to build stable countries that are democracies, even if they are imperfect democracies, as we are, that can be partners for us in international organizations and stand with us to stand for human rights, for better governance, for prosperity. As we build these, as we help participate in this great surge of development progress, this reduction in conflict is leading to more stable, responsible states that are good for us in the long run. So for very selfish reasons, we should be doing this. But of course, it's more than selfish reasons. This is good for all of humanity. But we do live in this most peaceful time in human history. There's a great book by Steven Pinker at Harvard called The Better Angels of Our Nature, which describes violence and war around the world for the last 500 years. It's a book about that thick, but it's a great read to have on your coffee table and look at some of the data.
Absolutely. So this is a partisan town. In an election year, it gets even more partisan.
No, it's not.
I'm going to get to that. But really, the progress that we've made and the impact that foreign aid has across the world, it's something Republicans can be proud of. It's something Democrats can be proud of. It's something Congress has a role in and can be proud of. It's something the White House and the administration has a role in and can be proud of. So, Michael, I'm going to ask you a question on the parties, and Steve, you a question on the institutions. But Michael, first to you. You're obviously a Republican. You worked for George W. Bush. Raj Shah, definitely a Democrat, worked for President Obama. You wrote this chapter on Moneyball together. Is it true? Tell the audience, is it true that this is actually bipartisan? It's not just you and Raj, it really is more than that. It's Republicans and Democrats agreeing that this is impactful and the success we've had.
Yep. Raj and I make the point in the chapter that the agreement we're talking about is actually not just compromise. It's genuine agreement on policy.
Yeah.
That's right.
That's something different.
And not very frequent.
Right, exactly. So you have a new approach to aid led by disease-related issues, but expanded to other areas that had immediate buy-in from the other party. So when in the 2003 State of the Union address, when we proposed PEPFAR, that was immediately adopted as a cause in the Senate by our partners there were Senator Kerry and Senator Biden. And when you went to the House, you had an alliance of Nancy Pelosi and Henry Hyde, who was one of the most conservative members of the House of Representatives, very religious conservative, pro-life conservative. That coalition, that PEPFAR coalition, is really something important. It united traditionally conservative religious people with more traditionally more liberal global health and human rights organizations. and they work together in genuine agreement on a very, very important project. I think that's remained. I mean, there have been heroes at every key moment, sometimes in unexpected places. But you look at someone like Lindsey Graham, who rose up in the Republican Party to really be a voice. Marco Rubio has been a large supporter, particularly on global health issues. Kay Granger has been a hero. So even though if you poll on these issues on the Republican side, you may get some mixed results, I think it's fair to say that there have been Republican champions at key moments that have helped save millions of lives and really shown the way to a different kind of politics in a certain way. It was, I think it provides hope even beyond these issues. It says that there are some issues that relate to human dignity that can be where there's broad ideological buy-in, where people can share and make a large difference. So when I go talk about these issues on a college campus or in a church, people are grateful for something they can do together that helps others and emphasizes our common humanity rather than our partisan differences. And so, I think you can get a lot of support across the spectrum on this set of issues.
Absolutely. Steve, in your book, you talk about kind of three paths for the future. One where tremendous progress continues, one where the progress kind of stalls out, and one where we actually slide backwards. And this is where Congress can come in. What's Congress's role? We're going to Capitol Hill tomorrow. What's Congress's role?
It's a big role, and let me link it to the last question, because I think that a lot of the bipartisan support in the past and therefore in the future has a lot to do with advocacy. I actually think it started a little earlier than PEPFAR. I actually think it started around debt relief in what became known as the HIPC program, the Heavily Indebted Poor Country Program, one of the worst acronyms ever invented, but that's what it is. And it started in the late 1990s with a bunch of advocates around Jubilee 2000, Drop the Debt, making the case that with the shift to democracy and better governance, that a lot of this debt that had been borrowed by old Cold War dictators should be dropped around the millennium. And advocacy by people like Bono, by the One Campaign, and forerunners of U.S. GLC pushed that through on a bipartisan basis.
And at the time, it was Bono and Jesse Helms.
Jesse
Helms, who embodied this outreach.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
And that set the foundation for Bono to then work with Jesse Helms on health issues, which around HIV/AIDS, and a big moment, I think it was 2000 or so, when Jesse Helms wrote the op-ed in the Post that basically said he'd been wrong on HIV/AIDS and we needed to support the victims of HIV/AIDS. And that happened because of advocacy efforts. It was a big role. So you all should feel quite empowered. And I know sometimes it feels like, well, you're just one voice among many. Well, the fact that you are one voice among many means that you are very powerful and have been very powerful in starting with that relief and then moving on to HIV/AIDS, to malaria, now on food security and on Power Africa. And the voices from advocates are very, very powerful. So, and that's going to help set the agenda for the future. Now, the future of developing countries primarily lies in the hands of people from developing countries. Sometimes we think it's all about us and we have a role to play, but let's be clear. The future is going to be largely determined by the courageous actions of the leaders there and the people there and what they do and the decisions that they make, and never forget that. But we can be and should be very supportive. So what Congress can do, first of all, we need to lead, frankly, and be a better example on democracy and good governance. We are too bitter in our fights, and countries watch, and we need, for our own purposes, but as an example to the world, to be better at forging compromise when it's necessary, or finding common ground which is not necessarily compromise, and leading on democracy and good governance. But we also need to invest to continue progress in health and education and good governance and economic possibilities. That's going to require shifting our foreign aid programs so that they're more supportive of private sector investment. I think it's going to require shifting some programs away from bilateral country to country and supporting aid that can go into investment into new technologies, new vaccines for children, new seed varieties that are going to be drought resistant and heat resistant, alternative forms of energy, those kinds of investments that aren't going to appear in a bilateral program with Mozambique or with Tanzania, but they could if we're investing, frankly, back home with our universities and research centers to come up with the kinds of technologies which are going to help countries move forward. We need to be much more clever in our foreign assistance programs about having different kinds of approaches. In those countries that are a little bit more advanced, have stronger democracies, we should be following their lead, providing the funding where they want to go, helping to build their financial institutions, thinking of different ways to actually deliver the money or the goods and services. It's going to be quite different from the failed states that still do exist, the failed and failing and fragile states, the Zimbabwe's of the world and other countries where that big transition has not yet happened. So we're going to have to be much more clever in how we deliver foreign assistance in different categories. But the big roles for the United States, I think, are to lead on democracy, to stand squarely with the countries that are striving to move towards more market-oriented systems and more democratically oriented political systems, and we stand shoulder to shoulder with them, and to think about investing more of our money away from the bilateral programs, or I should say, in addition to the bilateral programs would be even better, into primary research into the kinds of health and energy and agricultural technologies that can propel another generation of progress.
That's great. So we just have a couple minutes left, and I'm going to have Megan come back on the stage with some closing announcements. But before we get to that, one question, 1 minute each for both of you. We're going to the Hill tomorrow. We have over 200 meetings. What's your best advice for us going to the Hill tomorrow?
I think the most effective advocacy is easy to please and hard to satisfy. Okay, let me give you what that means. When I was in government, we wanted people who would praise what we did while they pressured us to do more. And not all advocacy is that way. Sometimes it is negative, sometimes it is condemning. I think this set of issues is an opportunity to say, great progress, great bipartisan progress, lots of momentum, but some serious challenges going forward. And you've been part of this in the past, and now you can be part of the future. So I think upbeat advocacy is really the most effective.
That's great advice.
My first piece of advice with 200 meetings would be drink a lot of water.
And wear comfortable shoes.
And wear comfortable shoes. But I completely agree with that. On foreign assistance issues, I've seen too much advocacy that I don't think works about people are starving and have distended bellies, therefore we have a moral reason to support them. That's correct, but I think it only goes so far, and I think it burns people out. And this is not a guilt trip. I think the positive story and lining that with why this is important for us as well as for developing countries. This really is a win-win. It really is a win-win. That it is good for us because it makes us more secure, it builds us allies, it helps us fight terrorism and instability and disease in other parts of the world, and it helps people in developing countries. And this is a win-win. And as Michael said, we have been successful. We have helped support this greatest surge of progress ever before in human history, and if we keep going and increase those efforts and be creative, we can continue to do that so that the next decade or two can see at least as much progress, and we will have a stronger, more secure, and more prosperous world.
That's great. Thank you guys so much. This was great. I learned a lot. Megan's going to come back on stage. Oh, there she is. A few closing announcements. We'll just sit for a second.
Thank you all for arming us with more knowledge and advice for our meetings tomorrow. I just have a few quick announcements for tomorrow. We're going to be having our breakfast on Capitol Hill, so buses are going to be departing here at the hotel at 7:15 sharp, so please show up on time. A note on luggage. If you're heading to the airport after the closing reception tomorrow evening, we would encourage you to bring your luggage with you. We're actually going to store it at the Reserve Officers Association where we're having the reception. But if you're spending more time in Washington or heading back to the hotel tomorrow, we'd encourage you to leave that luggage here if you don't need it. The breakfast tomorrow is going to be really terrific. We have two champions of the international affairs budget joining us for breakfast. Senator Ben Cardin from Maryland, who is the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and another good friend of ours, Congressman Peter Roskam from Illinois. So we're really excited they're joining us. Tomorrow morning, we'll have an opportunity to do some final strategizing together in our groups, and it's going to be a really fantastic day. So thank you again for all being here. We're really excited for tomorrow. Now we turn from Capitol Hill to Campaign 2016.
All right.
Well, we've launched a campaign called Impact 2016, and it's led by people like Madeleine Albright, Bill Frist, Tom Daschle, Tom Ridge, many others, just trying to elevate the issue.
Too often we look at the rest of the world saying, well, there may be hunger over there may be a drought over there may be a refugee problem over there, and it really doesn't affect us. Oh, yes, it does. Impact 2016, we started very early. We had our teams in Iowa, then obviously moved on to New Hampshire. Then we went to South Carolina.
South Carolina is at the forefront in terms of the presidential debate. We have an opportunity in order to engage our candidates to find out where they're at. I think we do understand the importance of America's role in global leadership.
As I come to you in New Hampshire, politics is your sport. You have chosen to be here to talk about a very, very important issue.
Today's forum is a wonderful opportunity to sit down and discuss how America's leadership matters to us here in the heartland of America.
We also have to have partners such as USAID. We have to have the State Department to make sure we are stabilizing those communities.
Well, the Impact 2016 initiative is a simple but very, very important effort to bring Republicans and Democrats together.
You got some nonprofit leaders, you got those retired from the diplomatic community, you got military leaders, you got business leaders who are committed to educating and shaping the debate.
It's an awesome responsibility to be President of the United States. It's important for those folks that are running to recognize the place of the United States in the world.
We made a huge difference in the dialogue and the debate that we saw.
The reach on both sides of the aisle has been to those men and women running for the House of Representatives and the Senate of the United States. So literally we've met with dozens.
I would urge the next president to have a balanced approach here. I believe strongly that if we cut the foreign aid budget, the longer the military operations are going to take and the more lives are actually at risk.
From Capitol Hill to the White House, what candidates say and do is critical to Americans' leadership around the world.
I don't want to be flip, but what's at stake in 2016 is America's global leadership.
All right, everybody come back. It's time to do Campaign 2016. So anybody here, there's an election this November? Are you tired of partisan politics yet? Already? Well, you may be, but we have a little bit of work to be done, and I need your help. So come on back. We have some treats being passed out. Yes, there's a presidential election, but there's also 34 Senate races, 435 House races, and as you may know, the difference between a Congress that believes in America being engaged in the world and one that wants to pull back rests in our hands. And ladies and gentlemen, we have 5 months to make a difference. So, everybody come on back in. We need you back in here. It's about raising our voices. It's about being smart and strategic. And that means meeting with candidates, writing op-eds with credible voices, many of whom are in this room, speaking at town hall meetings, and of course, voting. To date, a lot of you have been part of Impact 2016, which frankly, we think so far has been awfully successful. Of the original 22 presidential candidates, nearly all of them have moved towards our vision of America's global leadership. So far, with your help, we have met with over 75 candidates in candidate meetings, but we have a lot more to meet with. USGLC has created a platform, but it's your voice and your activism that's going to make the difference. So this treat that's being passed around is a little beginning of the celebration treat, because we need some energy to win the hearts and minds of all those candidates to make sure that they join us come November. And I know that we, with your help, will get there. So here's what we want to do before to kick off our beginning of our election 2016 afternoon. For the first time, USGLC wants to recognize the outstanding work of our state leaders who have been part of our journey, both in Impact 2016 and beyond. These individuals have really gone above and beyond in terms of their unique and powerful advocacy. So we're introducing our USGLC's inaugural State Global Citizen Award. The first is that we're very proud that there are over 30,000 veterans for Smart Power, nearly 200 of whom are here with us as part of our summit today. These are veterans that have really been game-changing in our advocacy. They have written op-eds, they come to our candidate meetings, they talk with policymakers. Some have even flown to Washington for some of our more difficult meetings. There's one veteran, however, who has done all that I just mentioned and beyond. Frankly, when we call, he answers. He has written the op-eds, he's talked to the press, and frankly, he has talked and talked and talked to candidates. And after all, he's from Iowa, and there's a lot of candidates that have come through that state. He has shared his passion for these issues, and it's very proud, ladies and gentlemen, to welcome and to congratulate USGLC's first veteran winner of our State Global Citizen Award from Elkhorn, Iowa, Rick Burns. So Rick, I want to ask you a couple of questions. This is really a very special individual, and I've gotten to spend a lot of time with him. And I want to know two questions. And the first is, you get to speak with a lot of policymakers. You met with a whole bunch of them in Iowa. We talked about a few when I was there in November. When you talk to them as a veteran, do you think it makes a difference?
Yeah, first of all, this is a very intimidating group to stand before, quite honestly, a little nervous. But I think since the end of the Vietnam War, when our veterans were not treated as nicely as they should have been, I don't think veterans have been held in as high a regard as they have since then. And I think that translates into influence. And I think, quite honestly, that influence has a pretty big impact. And I think those of us veterans who have served, I think we owe it to the next generation of veterans, of our military men and women, to make sure that we create an environment as best we can to eliminate the need for them to be put into harm's way.
So tell me, last thing, is you've done so much for us and for all of us. Why do you do it?
Well, I'll just tell you a couple of examples. When I was in Iraq, you could literally see the satellite antennas going up on houses and so forth. And so we have a whole generation since 2003, 2000, when we have a whole generation of young Iraqis and Afghans, for example, who have grown up on the internet, who have very intimate relationship with the world and are doing incredible volunteer kinds of things in their communities and changing their communities in a way that their parents could not have because of the dictatorial powers that they grew up in. The other thing is, there has never been in the history of the world more Afghan girls who have been educated. And I see that every day. These girls are doing incredible. They're leading. We have a sister city partnership with Herat that we're signing the middle of next week. the provincial council, a member of the provincial council, is an incredible young woman who's done amazing things out in the open in ways that would not have happened 20 years ago. And that's all happened because of the security that was created there and the opportunities for education that were given to these girls.
Rick, congratulations and thank you for all that you do. So much has been said about the rise of partisan discourse in our country, and at times both political sides don't, let alone listen to each other. Often they don't even talk to one another. Now at USGLC, we're actually very proud that we bring together Democrats, Republicans, and independents. And we're actually proud that we have an issue that brings people together and not divides. There are two people that I am fortunate enough to get to work with that have taken this theme to new heights. They are uncommon allies, but share a common belief in America's global leadership. Both, they are rivals at the ballot box, but they really have come together on our cause. Both have worked to educate candidates on our issue. Both have spoken at our events. But what most impressed me is right before their most contentious primary in their shared state, they've joined together to write an op-ed calling on candidates on both sides of the aisle for president to embrace foreign assistance, global development, and diplomacy. And as I introduce them, I think you'll understand why this is so unusual. So join me in welcoming our bipartisan State Global Citizen Award, Matt Moore, who is the chair of the State Republican Committee of South Carolina, and Jamie Harrison, who is the chair of the Democratic Party of the state of South Carolina, are winners of this year's State Global Citizen Award. Jamie and Matt.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
And as we should have said, the world is now in their hands.
Yeah.
They are phenomenal. So here are two rival state chairs, and I have to say, South Carolina is a fairly partisan place. And so let me ask you, does it make a difference when the two of you come together?
Well, first of all, Liz, you're very brave to give sort of two pseudo-politicians the microphone. We may never give it back, right?
Well, we've got 4 former politicians and 1 current right behind us, right. So you better get going.
Well, I accept this award on behalf of many volunteers, activists, NGO leaders. Liz, you do a wonderful job. Jamie and I are, as CNN has said, the odd couple in politics. Actually, season 2 on Netflix this fall. Check it out. Just kidding.
They're cute, too.
I had the opportunity to go to Africa with USGLC in 2014, a life-changing experience. Of course, South Carolina being the first in the South primary state, we had 17 candidates come through. I had ate a lot of hours in cars with those candidates and used the opportunity to break the ice, talking about USGLC's work in Africa, as well as NGOs and groups who are working to improve conditions there and engage across the continent. And we also did a number of things in South Carolina, including having Admiral Mullen come for a lunch in Columbia with surrogates from those campaigns, as well as a number of other things, including, I'm missing the final one there. Oh, the op-ed, yeah, a wonderful op-ed we did together. Enjoyed it, and came to D.C. to meet and have dinner with a presidential candidate that was campaigning in South Carolina. So all in all, I think we made a very big difference in directing the shape of the primary in South Carolina and keeping focus on these issues.
I sure think so. Jamie, what about you in terms of working together?
So
you didn't lose your job by working with
Matt? I didn't. I didn't at all. You know, in addition to being brothers in politics, you know, one thing I kid all the time, Matt and I, the person that I can go and talk to who understands the pressures of being a party chair, it's Matt. We really had a lot going on in South Carolina gearing up for the presidential primary, and I hope everything went well. At least you guys saw that, the perception that it went well. But let me just say that, you know, despite the fact that Matt and I are competitors as it relates to political races, we agree on one thing: the importance of global engagement. It's so important not only for the prosperity of this nation, but also the prosperity, the economic prosperity of South Carolina. We have the Port of Charleston, we have Boeing, we have all of these tire manufacturing companies in South Carolina. Trade is so important to us. But in addition to that, we're a military state. We're a state where faith is also very, very important. And we understand that we have an obligation outside of the world. We can prosper in the world, but we also have an obligation to give more. And so that's why Matt and I came together, because that's a value that we share.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me just ask you one thing. Why did you do it? What's at your heart?
I think as a person of faith, I live sort of by two general principles. And one is to whom much is given, much is expected. And the idea of being our brother's keepers. And what I saw of the work that USGLC and many others are doing in Africa, from PEPFAR to ending hunger, to saving lives across the continent, across the globe, you guys are making a big, big difference. American leadership is not an option, it is a requirement.
Jamie?
Well, you know, the reason why I do it is I have at home in South Carolina, I have a 20-month-old baby boy.
Congratulations.
William. And when he was 9 months old, his mom and I took him to Turkey. We went to Istanbul. We stayed there for over a week. And people said, well, why do you do that? It is because we're going to rear William to know that he's not only a citizen of South Carolina, he's not only an American citizen, but he's a citizen of the world. And it's important that we let him know and instruct him that he has a responsibility as a citizen of the world, and that global engagement is part of that. And so that's why I do it.
Ladies and gentlemen, please congratulate Matt and Jamie. Thank you both. So Rick and Matt and Jamie may have been up on stage, but really I thank all of you for being our citizen advocates. With your help on November 8th, the freshmen who are going to show up here, whoever they may be, will join us in embracing the issues that we advocate and we'll talk about on Capitol Hill tomorrow. So I thank you. We have a lot to do, and we're going to get started with two fabulous conversations. The first is going to be a discussion around the foreign policy experts, and then we're going to turn towards politics with Chuck Todd, who will conclude our conversation today before our expo and our networking reception. To introduce our panel, please welcome one of our longtime champions and board members, Nancy Susan Schlegel from Lockheed Martin. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Liz. Good afternoon. My name's Nancy Susan Schlegel. I'm the Vice President for International Government Affairs at the Lockheed Martin Corporation. And I'm also a proud board member of the USGLC. It's my pleasure to introduce this panel this afternoon. As we approach the Republican and the Democratic conventions and sprint to the finish in this great American race for the presidency, I know you all are asking yourselves, what does all of this mean for America's role in the world? Well, fortunately, we have a panel of some of the most well-respected voices in both the Republican and Democratic parties. Senator Evan Bayh was a leading Democrat in the Senate before his retirement in 2010, but he continues to be one of the most respected voices in Washington. Prior to serving 2 terms as his home state of Indiana senator, he served as that state's governor for nearly a decade. And Senator Jon Kyl, a real friend of the USGLC, he graciously co-chairs the Arizona State Advisory Council. He retired from the Senate in 2013 as the second highest ranking Republican after serving Arizona for more than 30 years. And Representative Mike Rogers, a Republican from Michigan, a leading national security expert. While representing Michigan's 8th district in the U.S. House, he chaired the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. And finally, Congressman Tim Walz, Democrat from Minnesota, a true champion of development and diplomacy as key pillars in our national security strategy. The discussion will be moderated by Emmy Award-winning Frank Sesno, one of the savviest journalists on foreign policy. His career includes 21 years at CNN, as the White House correspondent and Washington bureau chief. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists, Senators Kyle and Bai, Congressman Rogers and Waltz, and Frank Sesno.
Thank you for the kind words.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear us okay in the back? It is a delight for me to be back with you. I've been at USGLC many, many times, convening and engaging these conversations. It's a very important one, and one that I look forward to here this afternoon. So welcome. As you know, USGLC began the conversation this morning focusing on global challenges. So now what we want to do is we want to turn to the 2016 elections, the political environment, and it's quite a political environment last time I checked, and the environment that you're going to be encountering when you go to Capitol Hill. So a couple things before we begin with this incredibly distinguished and knowledgeable group. Public opinion polls show that Americans are inconsistent, at times ambivalent, sometimes hostile to global engagement. 2/3 of Americans say they want the United States to play at least a major role in world affairs. And yet, 43% think we should mind our own business internationally. And that's a decline from 52%, though, in 2013. So they want us to be engaged, but they want us not to be engaged. Now, we know that the stakes are very, very high, not just at the presidential level, but certainly for the next Congress. And we were talking a bit backstage about how that plays out on Capitol Hill in real time. Congress in the Senate, when 34 Senate seats are up for election with just 6 open seats, the control of the Senate is dependent on a switch of only 5 seats. And of course, all 435 seats are up in the House. That would include yours?
That's correct.
Okay, good luck.
Thank you.
With just a 30-seat spread for control and power there. We're about 34 days till the Republican National Convention, 41 days till the Democratic National Convention, 147 days till the national election, so who's counting? We'll dive in. Now, of course, before I start posing questions to this group, we obviously have to take into consideration that strange things happen, bad things happen, like the shooting the other day, which can very profoundly and rapidly change the entire dialogue and frame. So that being the case, we'll still dive in and try to make sense of what we're looking at here. So I'd like to start by asking how foreign policy is influencing the elections in both parties, and step back from the candidates. Both of the major candidates, Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, spoke today. Let's leave them to the side for the moment. We'll come back to them. Public opinion polls suggest that Republicans are more concerned about foreign policy than Democrats. 38% of Republicans named terrorism as the most important issue in the election. 38% of Democrats named the economy. So there's a very interesting partisan split. Senator Kyle, I'd like to start with you. How much do you see foreign policy influencing the election, the debate, especially for Republican voters?
Not enough is the answer. And unless there's some kind of major upheaval somewhere in the world or an attack, as we saw recently, public opinion tends to focus more on the domestic and in particular the economic issues. That's understandable. It's always been that way. But when we're talking about the President of the United States, we're not talking about a person who runs the economy, but we are talking about the Commander-in-Chief of the United States military and the most important person internationally with respect to international foreign policy. So there should be more attention paid to the role of the President, the qualities of the candidates for President, in my opinion, and those things can affect America dramatically. The economy will be influenced by the President, to be sure, But I think there's a bit of a mismatch between what the American people look to the president to do economically and the responsibilities of the president in terms of national security.
And when you say more attention must be paid or should be paid, is that from the candidates? Is that from members of Congress and others who are running around talking and debating the election? Is it the media? Is it people out here? I mean, where does that attention, where should it originate if it's really going to make
Well, leaders need to lead. And when there are serious problems in the world as there are today, leaders need to talk more about it. If they do, I think they'll find the American people more receptive to having that conversation. But in the absence of that kind of a conversation, they tend to default back to the economic issues that affect them more directly.
Senator Bayh, how about on the Democratic side?
Very similar to what John just outlined on the Republican side, Frank. But first, let me say what a pleasure it is to be here before such an august audience. You have a bipartisan group here today. It doesn't always happen that way in Washington, so hopefully this will start some momentum in that direction. And the second thing, I know we have state leaders here, maybe some from Indiana included, and I've always found that people coming from the states to talk to me in my office, Frank, can be very, very persuasive. It's better than when you have people who are in Washington full time, so the fact you're here is good. Very similar to what John just said, and you know, when you're in an election, it's going to be very hard to get a candidate looking at the polling data to talk about things, even if they're substantively appropriate, that just aren't dominating voters' votes. So my advice to everybody would be to try and make a domestic nexus out of the global issues that we care about. For example, if the economy, for many Democrats, as you indicated in your polling, is the preeminent issue, wages have been stagnant for more or less the last 10 years. What about increasing exports? What about opening up foreign markets? Because export jobs tend to pay much above the national average. That's a good way to support a middle-class family. So there's a global nexus there. Pointing out the tragedy in Orlando or in Brussels or in Paris, we're just, an event away from that being the kind of focus. What are we going to do with the Kim Jong-un in North Korea? This is a major problem. So John was exactly right. We're electing a commander-in-chief, and it's important to convince people that these issues that we care about here today continue to be important. But you can find ways to bring it back, Frank, to that domestic nexus, make a connection to the global development diplomacy issues, to things people care about at home. I think that's the most persuasive way to go about it.
Congressman and I were talking backstage before we came out here about what happens when you hold a town hall meeting and how do you engage these issues with your constituents. And maybe some of these issues are not the first things on their minds. How do you, as a leader, try to frame it in that direction? And by the way, given the debate that's ongoing now, if you try to pitch more exports and trade, how far are you going to get with that?
Well, again, thank you, and as the Senator said, thank you all for being here. You will play a key role in this discussion. I think Senator Kyle hit on it. Leaders are supposed to lead, and this was one of these issues, and especially after the tragedy in Orlando, it's incumbent upon leaders to lean into these issues. And I think listening to the polling data, I don't think that surprises anybody. I think Americans tend to. It's part of our national DNA that we should mind our own business type of thing. I think there's always, I don't think it's protectionism. I think it's more of that we can take care of things here, and that's a priority. I think it's incumbent, if you ask that question a little more, as Senator Bayh said, how it impacts them, there's a responsibility to bring that together, to bring it in. That as 4% of the world's population and large markets, especially Indiana and southern Minnesota, ag exports are important. But that is a very touchy subject right now politically, because it's easy to try and scapegoat the trade issue. We lost jobs over trade, and therefore we shouldn't touch trade. So I think it is incumbent that these are all foreign affairs, international issues. But as a member of Congress and a member of Congress running, I bet if you go look at your members of Congress Twitter feed, it will talk about the local team that won the state championship in softball. And that's important, don't get me wrong, but it's a little harder for them to engage on a national level to talk about solving the issue of what happened in Orlando or dealing with North Korea or China and the Spratly Islands. I think it's the leadership needs to, and I think that's where all of you, elections are points of leverage. Force people to talk about these issues in sophisticated ways that look for solutions. And I'm optimistic, as I said, these have to be tackled. The American people want to know they're secure in their lives, and they want to make sure that we're doing it in a way that protects their personal freedom.
You just said something very interesting, advice to the room, and I want to draw you out on that for just a moment before coming over here, and that is force people to engage these issues in sophisticated ways. So what works? How do you do that?
Well, I think for me, I want to, and because there is no simple answer on this. You see today that are like, see, I told you there was going to be an attack happening. That's not a solution. That's just stating the obvious where many are there. I think it's incumbent on all of you to bring these issues back to where they impact locally. Again, I'm a school teacher by trade, so I always talk about Maslow's hierarchy. Some of you remember this from your freshman psychology class. Don't hit on the self-actualization piece. Bring it back to home. Why engaging in the rest of the world is about economic security, it's about physical security, it's about all those things, and the U.S. role in that. So I think be very specific.
So if I was at a town hall and trying to raise an issue like that, I might start with a series of questions to the folks in the town hall and say, how many of you think we've got to do something about ISIS and dealing with that safe haven they've got over there where they're inspiring people to attack us? Well, all the hands would go up. Yes, we need to do something about it. Then my second question would be, okay, how many of you want to send your sons over there to fight in Iraq again or in Syria again? How many of you want to do that? Well, not quite as many hands would go up there. And then you kind of say, okay, well, let's talk about the role that diplomacy can play. Diplomacy might be a force multiplier where we can deal with some of these problems without having to do, we can solve the problem that you just said you wanted to do something about without resorting to sending in the troops as the first option. So diplomacy has an important role to play, and you might get some heads nodding and people starting to think about it.
And I should say one thing before coming over to Congressman Rogers. I'm actually writing a book right now on the power of questions, and what you just did illustrates that. When you pose a question to a room and you force people to answer that, you're engaging them in a conversation in a more persuasive way than if you're just talking at them. Congressman Rogers, since World War II, Republicans have been seen as the party of global leadership. They've been seen as the party of free trade. They've been seen as the party of engagement, global engagement. But we've seen very different views about America's role in the world during the primaries, from Rand Paul to Marco Rubio, certainly to Donald Trump. Do you think that we are seeing a return of the isolationist Taft Republicans from before World War II to challenge an Eisenhower or Reagan internationalist vision of the world?
Oh, look at the time.
I was so late in
Look at that.
I have an appointment to go on CNN and not answer the question.
How come I don't get a town hall question on that? And by the way,
give you a town hall question.
Exactly. I want to thank you for being here too. I will tell you this, and I think all of the members here and former members would agree that you are leveraging up your influence by being here and taking time to meet with members and sometimes staff. And that kind of dull look you had when we all got introduced, you'll see that in some of these people you talk to. That's your challenge, is to try to get through that. But I will tell you, they will listen to what you have to say, understanding that for every person sitting in this room, you represent 50, 100, 150, 1,000 people in your mindset, your views, and your engagement in the community. And that, to me, is a very, very powerful tool that you'll have tomorrow, and an important tool, especially when it comes to this. No, I don't think so. I don't think that the Republican Party on whole is going back to an isolationist party. And it really never went back. I mean, we have some moments. I do think that they are a little bit more trade skeptic, mainly because none of the news that they get is very good. And the last 10 years have been pretty tough. I come from a working class district in Michigan. We built cars. Matter of fact, Cadillacs. If you don't have one, see me after. Get you a great deal. And you know, if I went to a union hall at the bar at the end of the night, and we used to do this often, you could hear a lot of the themes, both from the Republican Party and the Democrat Party, in that drinking establishment. People are concerned. They've seen stagnant wages. They personally know people. One in I think 5 families now doesn't have anyone in them that has a job. 1 in 5, right? So that permeates around a community. So they're skeptical of trade. This means our challenge is I think a little, that bar is a little higher for all of us to talk about trade in ways that connect back to people. Now, it's easy in my district because we sell more Buicks, General Motors district, in China than we send in the United States. That, for me, being from a state that's probably not very pro-trade, was an easy conversation for me to have. Not every member is going to have that luxury to be able to put it in real terms, real jobs in a district. So I think that connecting it back is real. As far as the party itself is concerned, I think they're, again, skeptic. I still think when you look at the votes of trying to pull out votes for the next trade agreement, it will be predominantly Republicans and a few Democrats, like it has been pretty much for the last 70 years. And I think you'll still see that. I just think the challenge of the members of Congress and the Senate is where you go find those votes these days, and then how you, again, connect it back to each individual district. We sell trade awfully, and it is really easy in a 140-character tweet or a bumper sticker to denounce most of a good work of a decade of what trade can do, and really difficult to have that full-on conversation about the dynamics of it. And by the way, commerce is our best diplomat.
But let me stay with this for just a minute and also turn it back to the reality that the folks in the room are going to face when they go up on the Hill. You have a presidential campaign where both candidates say the Pacific Trade Deal is a bad deal and shouldn't be pursued. You have a country that is war-weary, right? War-weary, and feeling, at least it feels in the public discourse, pulling in. So how do you as a candidate deal with that? How do folks in the room, how should they anticipate how they're going to be received on the Hill, and how they should counter that when they're having their meetings there?
Well, if you're there for trade and diplomacy and economic relations and engagement, I'm not sure I'd start with I wouldn't lead with my chin on the war effort. I think you get to that by policy leaders and real leadership talking about what engagement for the United States military and why it's different from engagement in diplomacy and economics and other. And so you have to make those distinctions. I've never met a diplomat that I've ever worked with in all my time in Congress that really liked to use the U.S. military. It just didn't. But they always wanted the 7th Fleet over one shoulder and the 101st Airborne over the other shoulder. It's always a quicker way to yes, right, in any negotiation. And I think we have to learn to make those separations too. You can prevent a lot of problems. You can prevent conflict if you have a robust diplomatic and economic relationship with a country. There is a reason China is signing these unilateral trade deals everywhere they can, and I don't even think they care what's in them half the time. I'm not even sure they read them. But they're doing that because they want to have a leg up on the opportunity for markets in places they know that we've been negotiating for 10 years and can't get a trade agreement. And so we have to make that separation. I do believe both candidates have talked about strengthening the military. I don't think either one has a great plan on how we get there, candidly. They both said the right things on the size and strength of the U.S. military. And now I think it's up to the rest of us to try to engage that diplomatic and economic conversation in a way that we understand it prevents conflict at the end of the day. It doesn't drag us into conflict.
Senator Kyl, let me stay with you in the Republican Party for just a minute because it's interesting. You co-chaired the American Internationalism Project over at the American Enterprise Institute. Your report called for renewed global leadership and commitment to diplomacy and development alongside the military. Is there a divide, in your view, among Republicans over this view of America's role in the world?
There is, but I agree with Representative Rogers. It's not as big as it might appear to be.
It appears to be pretty big.
It does, but I think that's because the biggest megaphone right now is being held by the putative Republican candidate for president, who has a very firm view. But I don't think that his views reflect as carefully those of the majority of the Republican Party, albeit there is an element there that does tend to support his view of things. This project that Frank talked about was something that former Senator Joe Lieberman and I co-chaired. When we were preparing to leave the Senate, we noticed in both political parties a tendency toward a more isolationist foreign international view of things, and that concerned both of us because both of us came from the school that we achieve more if we're engaged in the world. And so through AEI, we brought together about 50 people from all political persuasions and affiliations and the like, and there was quite a consensus achieved that in all three of the major areas, national security, economic security, and something we called support for principles of freedom or democracy, in all three areas, Americans are much better off, and other people around the world are better off if America is involved, and particularly if America is involved early. And I'll just mention one illustration of it if I could. Both Trump and Clinton decry the trade agreements that have been negotiated, TPP and the one that's being negotiated, TTIP. I would challenge either one of them to give me 3 reasons why they're not good. I don't think they could tell me that, but nonetheless, they say, no, they need to be renegotiated. They're no good. And the question is, are we better off on the sidelines letting somebody else develop the economic rules of the world for commercial transactions in this global world of ours? Or are we better off in there fighting for the right kind of rules of the road, the economic rules that we know work very well in a place like America and have worked internationally for decades? Free trade, good, fair dispute resolution mechanisms, anti-fraud, which is a big problem in many parts of the world, and so on. We know what works to provide good commerce, and good commerce, of course, is good for both sides of the transaction. If we're not engaged in the world in a robust way in these negotiations, somebody else, the Chinese or somebody else, is going to be developing those rules of the road.
Senator Kyl,
we're much better off with American rules of the road than the others.
But if it works, and if it's so compelling, what are you pointing to that proves it and sweeps people off their feet? And why does this debate on the other side have so much resonance?
Yeah, there's more than I want to take the time, or you want me to take the time here, but I'll just give you one illustration. We spent $35 billion getting South Korea on its feet after the Korean War. Americans spent $35 billion. We benefit to the tune of $38 billion every year in trade with South Korea. So when you can help another country develop itself, it can trade with Americans, and it turns out it's as much to our advantage or even more than it is for a country like Korea. So there is an advantage. By the way, I'll tell you, the challenge is, in some sectors of our economy, the freer the trade, sometimes the greater the dislocations in specific places in America. But part of the answer to that is what Representative Rogers talked about. We build a lot of cars in America that are sold abroad, too. So you have to look at it both ways.
So, Senator by Congressman Waltz, let me turn to you and ask you about some of the dynamic in the Democratic Party, because there's been a little creative tension there, too, I think we've noticed. So Hillary Clinton has a long foreign policy track record, clearly.
Creative tension's a nice euphemism for all-out warfare, Frank.
Yeah.
Well, your word, not mine. But, she's been a fairly hawkish Secretary of State, and that's well documented. Democrats have often been seen, though, as the party of doves, and Bernie Sanders comes along, especially when he talks about the Iraq War, attacks her throughout the primary season. So do you see deep differences within the party about how America should be engaged in the world, the sort of Democrat version of this creative tension I mentioned?
There are some differences, Frank, to be sure. I think there are probably more differences on the trade issue than on the role of the country in national security. I think there would be a uniform view in the Democratic Party that doing something like Iraq again would be a mistake. So there's not a big appetite for that. But in terms of trying to combat global terrorism, that sort of thing, I think there would be a strong consensus in favor of that. On the trade side of things, it really has broken down, and for two reasons. The foremost of which is there's a growing body of literature, some studies out here just recently, that demonstrate that the theory that you reallocate labor, and so some people get moved into may lose their existing jobs, but they'll get retrained in place. They can be upwardly mobile again, and they'll get redeployed into another part of the economy where their wages are pretty much similar. That in fact has not been happening over the last 10 to 15 years. And so, I mean, take the Carrier facility in Indianapolis, which has gotten a lot of attention from Donald Trump and other candidates. 2,400 workers are going to lose their jobs there. The plant's going to be moved to Mexico. And so, maybe we save $100 on an air conditioner. And so we got to ask ourselves as citizens, is that sort of a part of the American bargain? Or do you look at things, if the current process is not working, like wage insurance? If it can be shown that someone has lost their job because of trade, well, all of us will benefit marginally from that. Don't we have some kind of responsibility to these folks, if they're just really not getting back on their feet, to give them some chance to get back on their feet, some period for adjustment? So you need to look to some other ways to make sure that this is not just sort of a one-sided street between consumers and those producers who are getting dislocated. That's number one. Number two is the enforcement part of this, and I agree wholeheartedly with John. We can't retreat from the world. We're so much better when we're trying to play a role in establishing what the global architecture for economic commerce is. But then what do you do when we lose $250 billion a year from intellectual property theft? So we sign these agreements, but just out-and-out theft takes place, and for some countries, I won't mention specifically here, it's almost a part of their economic development strategy. They're behind the West, and so if they can use a variety of electronic means to procure the intellectual property that Americans have invested a lot in, whether it's pharmaceuticals or automotive or what have you, and just kind of take it to jumpstart their own development. Well, they do that. Should there be no consequence for that? And what is the enforcement mechanism for dealing with that kind of thing? So in the Democratic Party, you need to address those two concepts if you're going to get folks back on the trade element again.
Congressman Walz?
Well, you see, they spoke very confidently for three who aren't on the ballot this November. But I think they spoke wisely. And I think you heard coming from both sides of the aisle, and this is a real challenge, and the idea of U.S. Global initiative, U.S. leadership in the world, because from a political standpoint, especially when it comes and boils down to the lowest common denominator on this, if you're running, you just say, I'll make you safer, and we shouldn't be building roads in Afghanistan. We should be building Highway 14 in southern Minnesota. That's what we need to do. You don't have to prove what the outcome of that is, and we end up proving a negative. In many cases, it becomes very, very challenging. But again, I think it goes back to what each of these folks have said. Senator Kyle said, and Mike was hitting on this. This is impacting real people's lives. And if you're in a leadership role, we need to start providing them solutions based on the facts, based on the history, based on the values of the country. And I do think that this gives us an opportunity, forcing people to lean into some of these conversations and people on the ballot. And it's not always easy.
You say giving people solutions. What
You have to
do you
make
mean
the
by
case.
that?
Make the case. The trade issue. I think the senator's right on that. It is toxic across the board. It's toxic.
Toxic.
Yes, I would argue that in the Democratic Party, that you can't mention trade because then it becomes the issue. It becomes a labor issue. It becomes that you are not committed to those labor rights, whatever it might be. That is simply false. That I think it is a false choice that you can't have good, smart trade policies that protect worker rights both here and abroad. That's what we should be looking for. Senator Kyle's right. When people dismiss a trade policy, it's important for us to ask them, what are the specific policies that you think are going to be detrimental? And I think our politics has to get back to that. And I keep coming back to this, where I had a former senator, and they said, how do we get through this bad environment we're in? How do we fix Congress or whatever? And he just pointed at me, and as he would have pointed each one of these, it's dependent on each member to go back to their district to talk about these solutions. And I don't think the public wants to be fed a line on this. They want people to stand up for this. I think the voters respond positively to people really trying to talk through these things, to make the case of why we need to stay engaged, why we need to help with democracies in Africa, why electrifying Africa not only makes sense from a humanitarian standpoint, it makes sense from an economic standpoint and a national security standpoint. It's our responsibility to make that case, and I would extend that to you. It's your responsibility to start making that case for smart policies that provide not only national security, which is a top priority of any member of Congress, but also have long-term economic benefits. We've fallen into that easy fix, easy blame, and we have to lean in and be a little uncomfortable at the town halls. I think Senator Bayh is exactly right, and you would be surprised the consensus you get when you put yourself out there and a little vulnerable and say, well, what do you think about this? Will this work? And then you have a responsibility to give the facts on why what someone is saying is both solid and where the holes are in that.
So when you lay this out, your town hall meetings are in full applause by the time you're done. And
they are not, but I taught high school and I supervised the high school lunchroom. It's 50-50 on any given day. So you do that to it, but I don't think it's about winning them over to my ideology. It's about having the courage to stay there or say things like, when Mike Rogers was in Congress, he was advocating for synchronization between the agencies to provide national security between DOD and State Department. And I stand up and say, that's exactly what we should be doing. We have to do a little more of that with current members too, not just former members. Show some courage, because my struggle is on this. How do we come up with policies that are resilient enough to extend beyond administrations? If it's going to take 25 years to defeat ISIS, that's a minimum of 4 presidencies, some of which I will like, some of which I won't like, some Michael like, not like, but we have to get there. And I think it all starts with having that honest conversation with constituents, not trying to sell them over. You certainly have to be politically astute in that room. You're right, they don't all cheer, but if I'm going to hold a town hall and I just want adulation coming back, that's not going to solve the problems. And I think we're in a time now where we're way past just trying to gaming those events.
You want to jump in?
Only to say, imagine a member of Congress walking in, and the best argument you have is that we know people are going to lose their jobs, but we have some job training assistance.
Yes.
I mean, think about that, right? I don't know any member of Congress that will do that walking. I know I wouldn't start there, but unfortunately, you don't have a lot left when you go in, because some of these communities will have displacement in their workforces. It is a huge hurdle. So that's the challenge, I think, that current members who are running, who are pro-trade, have. And I think everybody is obligated to try to help them through these arguments, number one. Number two, you know, the trade representative structure is old. And I think if we are truly pro-trade individuals, I don't care what party you are, you believe in trade, you believe it's good for the economy, you believe it's good for American engagement overseas, we're obligated to get out the toolbox and fix this thing a little bit. And I'll tell you, I serve on a couple of corporate boards for small technology startup companies, and they didn't quite get it right in the trade agreement, right? They missed that equation. Why? Because it was never there in all the other boilerplate language they pulled forward. And so my argument is, hey, listen, if we believe this, and we're going to ask members of Congress to go and defend themselves and talk about it, it needs to be as close to right as you can ever get in a trade deal. And I think we're a little behind on modernizing how our trade representatives, A, are trained, and B, have a full understanding of what the American economy looks like today. 20% of it is going to be e-commerce related here very, very quickly. And when you add the Internet of Things, 50 billion things being connected, it will fundamentally change all of our lives. And the trade representative is not, that sitting in the negotiations, they candidly got their clocks cleaned by the Germans on this issue. And I think that's where we all, as pro-traders, can say, not every trade agreement is perfect. We're going to help try to get this thing right up front and then help these members so their best argument isn't, when you lose your job, we will give you a government training voucher. I think if that's where we're going, we're going to have a very difficult time.
Totally defensive.
Frank,
yeah, exactly.
Can I just throw in I think there's some confusion, and we all play into it, that the trade agreements create the loss of jobs. That's not the way it happens. Trade agreements have nothing whatsoever to do with a factory moving somewhere. Carrier didn't move to Mexico because of a trade agreement. Carrier is moving to Mexico because the economic conditions are better for it in Mexico than they are in the United States. So the way you deal with people who say, but I'm losing my job, is to first say, why is that? Is it because the regulatory environment in this country is too antithetical to good business practices? Is it because the tax rates are too high? Is it because the workers down there will work for half of what you all will work for here in Indiana?
$3 an hour at the new facility.
Yeah. Those are the reasons why.
$3 an hour in Mexico.
Yeah. And you can't stop that. It's a little bit like gravity. If somebody in Mexico will work for $3 an hour and the least that somebody in America will work for is $20 an hour, you cannot stop a company that's global from moving. It has shareholders all over the world, and the obligation of the corporate leadership is to the shareholders. So that company is going to move. The answer is for the policymakers to develop American policies that make it more likely that business will not move, number one, that if it does, the rules of trade between the countries will be more fair. That's where the trade agreement comes in. And then third, there are domestic policies like the wage insurance or other things which have not been adequate and need to be improved upon, but that is something else that the American government can do.
Let me pull the conversation a little bit broader and past trade for a few minutes. As Liz knows full well, USGLC has engaged congressional members and races and been watching this for a good long time. And in looking at it in 2012 and 2014, was surprised to find actually that fairly few candidates, too few candidates anyway, had actual foreign policy, identifiable foreign policy sections on their website so that constituents, voters could go there and say, okay, what does this guy actually say on an array of foreign policy issues? But in 2016, as I understand it, you're finding something different, that there is more, and people are anxious to talk about foreign policy. So my question to you is, has something changed? Is it ISIS? Is it Zika? Is it... Why do you think people are more overtly identifying with foreign policy?
Well, a big part of it, Frank, is probably because of what happened in Paris and in Brussels and yesterday or the day before in
terrorism.
Yeah, sure. And people see what's going on in parts of Iraq and Syria and wondering what we're going to do about all that. So I think that's probably driving it. And the fact that we've now had this horrific attack on the homeland is only going to make that even more so. That and I think, a secondary but a latent understanding that economically some of what happens abroad is going to affect us here at home. You know, Chinese growth rates. What if the British vote to exit the EU? You know, that sort of thing. What if there's a spike in the price of oil because of some event in the Middle East? These sorts of things. But I think that's secondary. I think it's largely the national security aspect.
I would agree with that, why it's happening, but I would say from a Senate perspective as to a House perspective, that old adage, and it is maybe an overused cliche, but it's true that all politics is local. There's just not a desire, and I think of anybody who runs for Congress. I mean, if you have any self-awareness at all, you're thinking, look at all the issues I have to know. How could I possibly know them? And you're a little bit nervous getting forward. And I remember I was at an event where someone asked, they said, Congressman, you're a nice guy, you're a school teacher, football coach, whatever, but this is a complicated job. What are you going to do, for example, with China? And I couldn't believe my staff didn't plant this because I was able to answer in Chinese because I had lived there a little while. Because I was a geographer.
Know who you're talking to.
Well, I was a geography teacher, so the point being on this was, from a foreign policy perspective, I was actually quite surprised about being a high school geography and cultures teacher, how much that had engaged me in a way that really didn't come up that often. And I think when it came home, when it became terrorism, or when it became trade and jobs, people got more engaged. And that's not a pejorative against our citizenry. They're just busy. They just don't think about it a lot.
What you said, Frank, was that just Secretary Clinton and Donald Trump's websites, or was that all the pre-existing candidates?
Candidates.
Okay, but
House members?
The reason I asked...
House and Senate.
The Congress, too. Well, that is an interesting phenomenon.
That's the point. So I want to ask that, and folks, we're going to open it up to your questions in a few minutes, and sadly we're going to lose Senator Bayh because he's got to catch an airplane because he's maybe, I don't know, talking about a job.
And watching him run after an airplane,
Who knows?
that's really
but,
something.
I have a spouse who'll be very unhappy if I don't show up.
I see, okay. So state leaders gathered here, you're all going to Capitol Hill tomorrow to take up these issues and make the case for strengthening development and diplomacy in American foreign policy. Congressman Rogers, I'd like to ask you this one because this is an issue where on the Republican side there is a strong legacy, and it hails from the Reagan years. I covered the Reagan White House. I heard it a lot. This embrace of foreign assistance as an element of peace through strength. Ronald Reagan talked about it a lot. The first mention of a global development strategy in the national security strategy in 2002, PEPFAR, and on it goes. How can a future Republican administration build on the legacy for global leadership?
You mean by foreign assistance program, supporting our foreign assistance program? First of all, the percentage of the budget is just almost minuscule, which no reason not
knows,
to.
But the country seems not to know.
Yeah, and it's really, that isn't even a reason not to pay attention to it. Every dollar should be important, so I get that. We just have to do a better job about talking about what we get for that money. Pakistan is always an easy target for these funds, and I think Frank knows this well in the House. We had many a battle on the floor trying to stop people from taking all the money that we do in both military assistance and other programming away from Pakistan, because obviously Pakistan is some days with us, some days maybe not so much. The problem was we had a very difficult time trying to convince people about access. This is going to be the 4th largest nuclear weapon country in the world here very soon. So in order to serve U.S. interests, and they are our interests, that little bit of money offers us access and engagement in a way we could get no other way. And shutting the door, I'll guarantee you'll get no access. And you won't be able to have any influence on the trajectory of their nuclear program or military relations or the tension between Pakistan and India or what they're actually doing with bad folks that may be engaged against our folks in Afghanistan. All of those issues. And for that amount of money, I always tell people, is it this $100, or are you willing to send the 101st Airborne Division to fix it? I'm always willing to spend the $100. I look at it as insurance. Do you buy insurance for your home? Then we ought to buy international insurance so that we're not sending men and women into combat around the world.
It's an insurance and an investment, isn't it?
Huge.
I mean, it's
well,
really
the return on investment is huge. Even though and this happens in that populist debate every time we get into foreign expenditures, is because whatever the hot button issue of the day, fill it in the blank. Saudi Arabia was there for a while. They were always going after really small amounts of money. And I can tell you from the Intelligence Committee, the benefit that they provide for us in catching bad people is really, really valuable. The amount of money we spend is almost nothing. It also allows us to push them to a better place along the way, right? People aren't satisfied it doesn't happen yesterday, but we are having influence in Saudi Arabia to a better place. Yes, women can't drive today, but they've increased it now to, I think, 6%, which is double, which is not perfect. We wouldn't accept it here, but we're making progress. So that whatever that populist issue of the day, one time with Saudi Arabia, Pakistan recently, you could probably tell me the most recent one where we spend money, it's always going to be that populist issue because it's easier to go home and say, I cut off money to fill in the blank country because, boy, we ought not to like them. That's our challenge. I think we can get over this, but we have to have the courage to talk about it in ways that people understand. It is an investment.
Senator Kyle, I'd like to follow up here. Could we play a game for a minute, you and I?
That all depends.
He's like Watson.
Let's pretend that you could meet with Donald Trump on this issue.
You may want to catch that plane with Senator Bayh right now.
No, I'm looking forward to this.
And talk to him about strengthening development and diplomacy and peace through strength and the Republican foreign policy. What would you tell him?
I'd say, you know, what I want to do is make America great again. I've heard that somewhere. You want to make America great again. So we are together on this. Let's figure out how we're going to do it. First of all, you can't make America great again by not doing anything, right? We've got to do something here. We're behind the 8 ball. Well, what's one of the areas he's talked about? We've got to rebuild our military. We've got a military that's worn out, it's tired out, the equipment is tired out, and a lot of countries are getting better than we are in a lot of technology areas. We've got to improve our military. So first of all, we need to spend some more, and we need to invest wisely in getting our military back up to the point.
I asked about development and diplomacy. So you started with military. Keep going.
Okay. Secondly, if we're going to help to, you know, what part of your deal, Donald, is the Chinese are killing us, the Mexican government is killing us on these trade deals. All right, so we'll just go hide. Well, they're going to keep killing us, obviously. Unless you're in the game, you're never going to score. So you got to get in the game. And we're so smart, because you're so smart, because you're going to point to really smart negotiators. You're going to point negotiators that are going to, by golly, represent the United States well. So we need to get in those trade negotiations, figure out what our goals are, and negotiate really hard deals. And then we'll go on to the details of that kind of thing. And then a final point. So we've talked about national security. We've talked about economic security. We also have values in this country. And here's an area, Donald, where you may not quite, where we may not be on the same page, because you haven't talked about the role that American values can have in helping Americans. And the reality is, if everybody else agrees with us in their values, we're going to have a lot easier time of it, aren't we? I mean, we're not going to have a lot of enemies starting wars and all that kind of stuff. So let's see what we can do with the values that have worked for us, made us the greatest country in the world for over 200 years, and helping those who aspire to have the same kind of freedoms that we do. Does that mean we have to be sheriff of the world? No. Does that mean we have to go start wars every place? No. But if it does mean that we have to show by example the kind of things that America can help others achieve, that's a good thing. We do that through diplomacy, through our aid programs, through all the different kinds of exchange kind of programs, everything else that over the years has caused people to want to come to the United States because they've heard about how great it is here. I don't hear people wanting to immigrate, for example, to Russia, for example. So if it works here, if people like us here, let's try to share some of those values with other people. Those are the 3 areas. If we are successful there, we will make America great again.
What about Edward Snowden, Johnny? He seems to have emigrated to Russia.
Yeah, that's right. I don't know if he did that all that voluntarily.
I'm not sure that's part of Trump's campaign platform. But,
yeah.
All right, fair is fair. And you probably had some of these conversations. Hillary Clinton's come out against TPP, which she was in favor of before. She's beating up on trade, too. If you had a chance to tell her how she should right the ship of state and her candidacy, what would you tell her?
I think it'd be a little bit briefer and easier conversation than the one you assigned John just a minute ago, since she's labored in these vineyards for many, many years. I sat next to her for 6 years in the Armed Services Committee, traveled with her, Frank, to Pakistan, to Iraq, to Afghanistan. It was only Congressman McHugh from New York who was with us, the 3 of us, and so got to see her interact with heads of state and so forth. I was complaining once about how tired I was, and she looked at me, she said, "What are you complaining about? You don't have to worry about your hair." So, in any event, so on the trade thing, look, I think there's an element of political realism in that. But as I pointed out, there's also a
So what does that mean? She's pandering and she'll get off of it?
No, I don't mean that. I think, look, in a democracy, you always have to, pay some attention to what the public is thinking. That said, you can't surrender your principles, and the substantive change that has taken place Frank, is what I tried to outline, and you were kind of nodding your head about these studies that show that some of these folks who are displaced from jobs, they never do get back. They are suffering a permanent diminution in their standard of living. And so we have to ask ourselves as Americans and consumers, if we're benefiting from all this, do we have some sort of obligation to try and help those folks get back on their feet? And that's a relatively new phenomenon where the analysts have determined that it just was not working the way we all had thought. And the intellectual property theft issue that I mentioned too, I would encourage her to work her way through those two issues, but then engage, because we are better off when we're selling goods and services abroad.
I know we need to let you go and get to an airplane, and we've got people questions that we're going to come to the floor immediately. But in parting, and thank you so much for your participation here today, any last word, observation, guidance to the people in this room?
Well, yes, let me mention two quick things first, and I want to thank everybody. John mentioned the slogan, "Make America Great Again." John, I was kind of chuckling recently. I saw a picture of the Queen of England, and the slogan was, "Make America Great Britain Again." So maybe that's an alternative slogan out there. But, I found myself a couple of years ago.
They build very good walls in Britain.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, well, at least Hadrian did. In any event, that one didn't hold him out for long either. I found myself in the office of a very high-ranking Saudi a few years ago, and was ushered into his room, high-ranking minister in the government. And there on the wall, and I don't say this to pander, big flat-screen television tuned to CNN, because it was another election cycle.
I'm for that.
So I took an interest, and I said, I asked the minister, I said, Minister, I'm curious, you're watching the coverage about America's election. I'm curious why you're doing that. And he looked at me and he said, well, very simple. We screw things up in our country, it's bad for us. You mess things up in your country, it's bad for the whole world. Well, that's true. But the reverse is also true. We have an interest in what's going on, and a selfish interest in what's going on in the rest of the world, because inevitably it affects all of us. We can either attempt to try and shape those events and do something about it proactively, or bear the consequences of neglect, which history would judge are invariably much, much more severe. So to end up, Frank, I would just like to thank all of you for what you do, for being voices of engagement and in reason, and don't be surprised about the impact you can have. It always made a difference to me when 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people from parts of my home state would show up and tell me what people were thinking back home. You can make a big difference, and I'm glad that you do, and I'm grateful for your hospitality today, and I apologize that I've got a plane I got to catch in rush hour traffic, which is a little worse than Indianapolis rush hour traffic.
Senator, thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
And we'll start with you. Tell us who you are, where you're from, and fire away.
Karen DeBartolome, World Denver, from the great swing state of Colorado. And I'm
See,
wondering.
I'm wearing a purple tie just for you.
Okay, good. We're a purple state. I'm wondering what are your assumptions about the millennials? How are they going to vote? Are they going to vote? How are they going to vote? How might that play into this global engagement theme?
And you're directing this to Congressman Waltz because of the burn factor in the millennials there, or yes? Okay.
Well, again, this may go back. We're all products of our past. I have great confidence in this generation as a school teacher and as someone who's been around them. This generation is engaged. All of the metrics point to how engaged they are. They're volunteering more than ever. All of those numbers that we would say a positive citizenry, this group of folks right now are doing a very good job with it. And whether they were at Bernie rallies or whether they're watching this or whether they're at Donald Trump rallies, to be very honest, they're engaged. We think the numbers are up. I know it's always challenging to try and get young people to vote. I think those are broader issues of how do we make it easier to vote? How come we're not voting on Saturday and Sunday? How come we're not doing more mail-in and all of those things? But I do think they're engaged, and I think they bring the perspective you're all asking about is I think they tend to see the world more globally. I think they tend to see themselves as connected more so than maybe even my generation and those before. So I think they'll be there. I don't think you can count on it'll be the massive numbers. It's always challenging. It's a Tuesday afternoon in November, but they, to me, and I see this, pretty heavily engaged, pretty concerned about this. And you all know that the statistics about this, we know in politics, if you engage them early, there's a good chance that they will be lifelong voters, lifelong engaged in the process. So I'm optimistic they'll be there.
Over here, go ahead.
Afternoon, I'm Graham Huff from Atlanta, Georgia with League of Hope. And I'd like to get your insight on how you view the current level of partisanship affecting the sitting Congress' ability to pass legislation for the remainder of this term, and then maybe project forward into the 115th?
Congress, let me let you start with that.
He asked about this. Your perspective. I asked Mike about this as a former member and someone who had respect across the aisle, how he saw it. Maybe it'd start with him on this. So,
when we were chatting, I don't think we're telling a tale out of school. That maybe it's being 10 yards away. I retired in January of 15. It looks worse to me than it did even when we were there. And some of that's a product of being there, thinking, "Hey, I can do this, right? We can do this." I'm very worried about it. I think until we stop rewarding behavior in Congress in both parties for people who don't want to have anything happen, which we do all across the country. I mean, Congress, you get the Congress that we all vote for. That should scare you all to death, right? This is the Congress that America chose. And they took some pretty harsh positions early on, and it has fractured what is a normal coalition event. So the Republican Party is a group of coalitions. The Democrat Party is really a group of coalitions, and they tend to self-identify closer to one party than they do the other party. And it doesn't mean that there isn't folks that can cross over. I think Frank and I worked together very well when we were in Congress. And until we, again, start changing that attitude, I mean, we can't get budgets done now. They're not going to get a budget done. How does something that spends $2 trillion not have a budget? I mean, you would not survive, and none of you in this room would survive, I don't care what you're doing, if you didn't have to have a budget to be accountable to. You just wouldn't survive. How do we don't ask the members of Congress to be accountable for $2 trillion in spending is, to me, it's shameful.
So let me follow up. I'm sorry, what was your name again?
It's Graham Huff.
Graham?
Yes.
So let me follow up on Graham's question, because Graham's question is a great question. Your answer is very direct and very honest. And the follow that I hear, not from Graham, but I'm going to give you credit for having the follow, but from lots of people is, okay, what do we do about it?
I got that.
It's all yours.
Two things: nonpartisan judicial redistricting, and then campaign finance reform. Because its whole thing is throw all, and I see it just out of practicality. It's a throw all the bums out, and I say, yeah, there'll be a whole new set of bums. The redistricting process has made it. I have colleagues that I can't believe there's an inch of space either to the right or left of them, and they get primary challenges. We're distilling this down to a purity test that makes it entirely impossible, and there, as Mike said, there's no benefit to try and do this. I have been touting that Georgetown and the Lugar Institute did a 20-year study of partisanship. You're not, by all statistical measures, analytical measures, this is the most partisan Congress we've ever seen. There's no crossover of moderate Republicans and conservative Democrats anymore. And you rank them all from 1 to 535, having the Senate in there. And I rank my very high ranking. Well, you might not be surprised by this, though. Then from my side of the aisle, it's like, oh, Tim's too willing to compromise from them. From the right side of the aisle, he's just pretending and he's not pure enough on that. But I have a unique perspective that I continue to come back here because I have one of the rarest of rare animals, a rural district that's 50-50, split right down the middle. So to be able to win that district, you have to be pragmatic, you have to be willing to work with one another, and I've seen it has nothing, I'd say it has far more to do with the district composition than it does with me. So if you could get those two things in there, you'd have a broader choice of people and you'd have a much more willingness to come. That doesn't mean we should get rid of the ideological perspectives that bring us to a coalition, but it brings much better chance of compromise, and then thus the political the positive political feedback you get, because there's no penalty now for not compromising.
Senator Kyle, before we go to the next question briefly, thoughts on that? Is that your prescription?
Because we've had such a kumbaya session here, I'm going to almost totally disagree with what was just said. The part I'll agree with is that the congressional districts, which tend to be far more to the the two edges, do create more partisanship. That's true. However, we have one of these commissions that do the redistricting in Arizona. It hasn't changed anything in Arizona. I think the worst thing you'd want to do is turn it over to judges. That's not their job. I don't think that they would want to do it. I don't think they'd do a good job. And when you talk about campaign finance reform, I'm reminded of the novel in which the lady is knitting, and she says, reform? She says, sir, don't talk of reform. Things are bad enough already. Every congressional reform attempt at campaign financing has made things worse. Starting, or at least
so what do you do?
As part of McCain-Feingold, you get back to a situation in which the political parties and the candidates were in control of their own races. Today, they are adrift in a sea of all kinds of different PACs and 501c4s and 527s and other groups that are creating the messages that are driving the votes in their district, and frankly, they can't raise enough money to compete with that. So you've taken the campaigns out of the hands of the candidates and the political parties and put it in the hands of people with a huge amount of money who can, with just one or two people, can make a huge difference in a district. That's not reform.
On that uplifting note, let's go to the next question.
That was close to our Jerry Springer
Thank you.
moment.
Good afternoon. I'm Norma Mose from Colorado. I'm very focused on helping creating jobs on this side of the border, focused on emerging markets and creating opportunities in the energy market. So I know we're talking about the presidential race and we're focusing a lot, but of course there's a lot of congressional races and a lot of opportunity and competitive races going on there. So with that in mind, what are you seeing as some of the key issues in the congressional races, and how much does foreign policy weigh in those races?
Congressman?
Well, I think they weigh a lot. And again, it goes back to how you're framing these. I make the case, too, on energy independence in emerging markets, that is not only an economic perspective, that's a national security perspective. And so as your candidates, you start talking about that, there's that opportunity. Folks are looking for the stability, as you've heard everyone up here talk about. There's angst amongst the public. There's angst amongst declining wages. There's fear of trade that it's going to mean diminished jobs, whether that is factual or not. That's their perceived reality, and so that's reality. I think it's important, again, that it's up to those folks running for office who are thus asking to be in leadership positions. Are you framing it in a way that makes sense to them based on the facts that are there? And I think there's golden opportunities for this. Again, we get caught in the minutia of this. The argument, again, if you're making the case on climate change based on that self-actualization piece, again, that we should do this for long-term stability or whatever, it's harder to make that because people are not selfish, and whether they believe or not, they want to turn on their lights, they want them to come on, and they want their bill to be so small that they can pay for it. Those are all realities. We should be working for solutions that are win-win-wins on that, and I think we eliminate a lot of those where there are similarities amongst the parties that you're not going to have a lot of disagreements. But whether it be foreign engagement, whether it be domestic policy, whatever it would be now, everything is filtered through that purity lens of political ideology that makes it virtually impossible. And I think that's what's frustrating the country, that you could be a Republican who says, okay, I get it, the climate issues there, whatever it would be is, but what I'm really concerned about is here's how we address it in a way that helps the economy. And I think that the country's hungry for that. You can see it in their eyes when you talk to them about it. They don't want the same platitudes, and I think you're absolutely right, that if you tie it back to their own personal family economics, if you tie it to the broader economy of the country, and then if you can tie it to national security, you're going to win people over, and that's how it should be done.
Let's go over here. Sir.
Larkin Eggleston from North Carolina. To address the first question, I assure you there are plenty of millennials that will be voting in November.
Yeah.
Being from a purple state that doesn't have equal representation in Congress, I'm encouraged to see the four of you that were up there be able to have a reasonable and respectful discussion. Is the only reason that was possible because three of you aren't seeking re-election, and is there hope for us to have a similar conversation if we'd have put four current Congress members up there?
No, it's really all because of the moderation.
Yeah. Well done.
No, but it is, and you think about this in the aftermath of an Orlando, and you think about this in the aftermath of so many of these events. How do we have adult conversation? How do we have respectful civil discourse in this country?
Well, I mean, Congress is split because America is split. I think there are lots of concerns on both sides of that issue. I would take one exception. I think in the national security space, my partner on the Intelligence Committee, a guy named Dutch Ruppersberger, who was Democrat from Maryland, you didn't find too much room between us because we sat down up front and said, these are national security issues. We're going to put all the partisan issues that get people riled up away so that we can work on budgets, policy review, covert action review, all the things that we thought were important. Now, he was a prosecutor. I was a former FBI agent. He used to say that prosecutors, even though he was in the minority at the time, always have their FBI agents listen to them. That was the only time we really argued about that. But it can happen. And to tell you the truth, that was more rare than it should be. We did have a lot of members, because we would sit and talk to each other on the floor a lot, and Frank remembers this, come up and say, on other committees, saying, how do you do it?
I'm Frank.
Yeah, I know that. That's what I say. They said that, how do you do that? How do you make that happen? And so I think that can happen, but again, if we don't reward that behavior, and I can tell you, people will come up to anybody who's engaged in any negotiation on Capitol Hill. I'll guarantee you a member has gotten some flack from their party. I don't care if they're Republican or Democrat. I don't care who they are. They've gotten some flack. You're caving in. You're giving too much. What are you doing? We have to change that. We have to change that by rewarding members who are sitting down, not giving up on what their ideology is. You don't have to do that. But you do have to actually work for an accomplishment. Until we do that, you're going to see a lot more of this.
Got a lot of questions and only a few minutes, so let me move over here to the next question.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Chuck Tucker. I'm the executive director of an NGO that does international development work and a recovering retired Air Force officer. We have two presidential candidates that have historically high negatives, and we've had a couple of presidents in the last 15 or 20 years who have had very strong vice presidents. I'm wondering your thoughts of who each of the major candidates could have either as a vice presidential candidate, and if not by name, if that's too high.
Yeah, we should get the name.
Get the name. Maybe talk about some skill sets that would augment the perceived negatives of the two current candidates.
You're on.
Oh, well, yeah, and I do think that the presidential negatives issue, but what I'm more concerned about on that is I'm wondering if we can ever have a president again that can garner some bipartisan support in any way possible, because I'm really concerned about the lack of continuity between administrations and this idea that we are absolutely opposed because this is a Republican presidency. And don't get me wrong, both sides have done it. There was strong opposition, I know, to President Bush, especially in the final years of his term.
So who would help Hillary Clinton as a running mate? The guy sitting next to you?
Well, if I was self-serving, they've mentioned both senators from Minnesota, so that would be as ones there. I think, yeah, I do like, and I have to tell you this, and I think I would be, I'm biased on this. I'll be interested to hear what my two colleagues say just quickly, but I think you're wanting to see it's someone that mirrors you a little bit. There's all this talk that you have to balance the ticket out to bring people in. I think the public's hungry for somebody who can get the job done on this, and I think there's numerous folks out there. I'm just really interested. I think it would be somewhat shake the boat a little bit on this if it might not be the usual suspects in the United States Senate, that there might be somebody else out there. So when I hear a little bit of talk about Tom Perez that a lot of people don't know, I think that's very interesting because I've watched him work. So that's as far as I'll go on that.
That's not bad. Senator Kyle, who helps Donald Trump?
Because the numbers are so bad for both of the two putative nominees, this might be a year in which the selection of the VP candidate would actually help them.
Good.
And I'm not going to give you names, but ordinarily it doesn't help that much. This time it just might because their numbers are so
You interested
low.
in the job? Can we get you back?
No, thanks.
Not a chance, huh? Okay. Last question.
Hi, my name is Dr. George Lance from New Hampshire. I've had the pleasure of serving the military, the Army, for almost 20 years, and starting the infantry, going through the military police, ultimately ending up in the medical corps. During my first deployment to Afghanistan, one of the things that I had the opportunity to do was work with arguably the most educated people from the Middle East, other physicians. One of the things that was a massive hurdle that I didn't realize we had until one evening when it almost came to blows was, I won't name the country, but these highly educated people could not face the reality of simple things like the fact that the Holocaust actually happened. And in that moment, I recognized that we had a massive hurdle we had to overcome. So these people that we're taking care of that did not hold, couldn't read, couldn't write, were still making homes like Charlton Heston in the Ten Commandments with mud and straw. What's being done to reach and overpass this hurdle, to educate people in the shadow of what just happened a couple days ago? This is a massive hurdle that I think ultimately diplomacy has to handle, because we can win hearts and minds saving people, but in the end, what's being done
It's a very big and a very important
Yeah, it's an
question,
important question.
and sadly we don't have much time. Let me let you take a look at it.
Well, I would say I think all of us have evolved in that. I think the idea, and it's a noble cause, that we would like to bring American-style democracy to other parts of the world so people can do self-determination, they can live their lives to the fullest, and they can do that in freedom. There are some building blocks that have to be in place before society is able to do that. I mean, every school in America has Thomas Jefferson's quote about the need for public education to be able to make sure you have to, first of all, have an educated populace before they're ready for that. So I would say this room here gets that our goal is the same, a self-stable, mutually inclusive world where people and the entire world is able to function the way we would like to see, with democracy being part of it. But that cannot happen with all those building blocks. That's why I think all of you are in this room to focus on that piece of it. It's critical.
Senator Kyle, quickly.
Just quickly, our government has had in the past, and we have some private sector groups as well, the National Endowment for Democracy, Radio Free Europe, things like that, which can help to create a better educated public abroad, which also informs them about world events and a little bit more about America. I think those are very useful programs. They are greatly underfunded. It's one of the things I hope you can speak to when you go to the Hill tomorrow.
Congressman, that's good.
Spent a lot of time in Afghanistan as chairman of the Intelligence Committee. About 90% of all the Taliban fighters they took off the field learned everything they believed was in the Quran because someone told them, because they had never read it.
Right.
They had never read the Quran. We did something hugely important in Afghanistan. America got no credit for it, and we're slowly backing away from it. I think this will be a stain on our national character. We asked half of the population to come out from back of their houses, imprisoned, women, and get engaged in society. And they did that. They opened up schools in the eastern provinces. If we want to solve that problem in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, you need to engage women in society in a way that tempers that influence. And we shouldn't walk away from that. I worry we're getting ready to walk away from it because the mission is so hard. They've already closed 274 girls' schools in the eastern provinces. And I think that would, as I said, would be a stain on our national character if we've asked those women to come out and participate, and now we walk away from them.
I'm terribly sorry that we're out of time and we don't have more time for your questions, but I want to thank each of you for your observations here and suggest that what you've heard here, I think, is a very interesting and very important combination and conversation about how to get involved, how to make the case, and how to persuade others that this is something that is worth investing in and buying as an insurance policy. Those two I's, investment and insurance, I think is an interesting way to put it. The other thing I heard you say, which strikes me as resonant, something we talk to our students about at GW all the time, and something I did when I was at CNN, and you're now doing when you go on the air, is tell stories. Make it real. Bring it down to the level and the relatability that people can understand and that they can remember and that they can take with you. When you talk about where the investment is made and where women are coming out of it gets real. So we all wish you great luck and happy journey, good times. May we live in very interesting times. We certainly are doing that. And thank you all for a fascinating conversation.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome U.S. GLC Treasurer Ann Lewis.